All right, the living world, ecosystems, global currents and biomes, and now we're on to ocean currents. We have seen that the unequal heating of Earth together with this Coriolis effect drive air currents all over the world. And these phenomena together also will affect the ocean currents. So we're about to explore the circulation of ocean waters, both at the surface of the ocean and at the deep part of the ocean. By the end of this presentation, hopefully you'll be able to describe the patterns of surface ocean circulation, explain the mixing between surface and deep oceans, and what a it's called a thermohaline, but there's also a halocline and a thermocline circulation, and then identify what causes, El Nino. So the flow of ocean water is an important factor for global climates because it moves warm and cold water to different parts of the planet. And in doing so, these ocean currents affect primary productivity, which is found in all over the world, but essentially adjacent to each other. When warm ocean currents flow to the tropics or into higher latitudes, the neighboring continents receive warm air from the ocean. So in this, we're going to examine the major ocean currents that occur near the oceans. Surface oceans, and then the currents that mix with the surface waters and the much deeper waters. A gyre is a circulation pattern, but on a very, very large scale. These gyres move clockwise in the northern hemisphere and counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere. When winds in the northern mid-latitude regions push water from the southwest to the northeast, the Coriolis effect that deflects the currents so that water actually moves, it's shown in an overall effect. See, ocean surface currents between the equator and mid-latitudes rotate clockwise in that direction. And in that counterclockwise direction in the southern hemisphere, so where they meet, we call that a equatorial current. Just as air currents redistribute heat, ocean currents redistribute heat and even back into the atmosphere. So cold water from the polar regions moves along the west coast of the continents, and it brings with it cold air immediately above these to these warmer waters. So let's use from California, for example. The California current, which flows from the south of the North Pacific along the coast of California, causes these coastal areas of California to have a cooler temperature than areas similar in latitudes to California across the planet. This is essentially because that same current has picked up colder water temperatures because it's coming from the north. And so in addition to that, warm water from the tropics, moves along the east coast of the continents, and then the warm air immediately above it rises and causes these warmer temperatures on land. And that's how these ocean currents moving upward is what we call an upwelling. So this explains why ocean currents can help us explain why some regions of the ocean support this highly productive ecosystem and others not. Along the west coast of most continents, the surface currents diverge, or they separate from one another. This causes deeper waters to rise and replace the water that has moved away. This movement of the upward water towards the surface is shown in a blue in this diagram, is where the upwelling takes place. So the deep waters bring with them nutrients, from stuff sitting on the bottom, and that's enough nutrients to support a large amount of producers, and so in turn support a large amount of population of fish, and that's where fisheries are. So this upward movement and this mixing, if you will, is where we can predict there's going to be a high fish population to fish or support a huge ecosystem there. So another oceanic circulation pattern is what we call the thermohaline circulation, and this drives the mixing of the surface water and the deep water. All right, so this process is crucial because moving heat and nutrients around the globe determines a lot. The thermohaline circulation appears to be driven by surface waters that contain this unusual amount of salt. So in this figure, that I'm about to show you, will show how warm currents flow from the Gulf of Mexico to the very cold North Atlantic. And some of the water freezes or evaporates, and what remains behind is this enormous amount of salt. That's a salt concentrated water. This cold, salty water is relatively dense. I mean, you would think. So it sinks to the bottom of the ocean, mixing with these deeper waters. This two-part process, the sinking of the cold, salty water and being at this high latitude where there's rising warm water near the equator, creates this movement necessary to drive these deep, cold currents that move very slowly past Antarctica. So in this picture, you can see that warm water is flowing from the Gulf of Mexico to the North Atlantic, where some of it freezes and evaporates. And then the remaining water, now very, very salty and dense, it sinks to the bottom of the ocean. And then that cold water that's traveling along the ocean floor, which is basically connects the entire world's ocean, and it's very, very deep, it'll eventually rise to the surface and it circulates back around to the North Atlantic. So this is a current, but it's circulating the globe in this pattern. This globular round trip can take 100 years or more to complete. And so in that previous figure, that circulation is very old. And any disruption of that can set off the whole system. Ocean currents associated with a thermohaline circulation are affected by nearby temperatures, by land masses, by gyres, by surface areas, a lot of things. So, for example, like the ocean current known as the Gulf Stream, which originates in the tropics of the Gulf of Mexico and flows towards Western Europe. Now, this movement of this warm tropical water brings warmer temperatures to latitudes that would not have warm temperatures. It normally would be cold in Europe, but that is where the currents are bringing this warmer temperature and increasing the normal temperature of that landmass. So scientists are just concerned that global warming could affect this thermohaline circulation. If an increase in air temperature accelerates the melting of the glaciers in the northern hemisphere, then the waters of the northern Atlantic could become less salty and less likely to sink. And such a change will really shut down the thermohaline circulation. Every 3 to 7 years, the tropical current that moves in that opposite direction, because of this phenomenon that we know as the El Nino event. This shift in this oceanic current is just fascinating to me, and that's why you hear sometimes where we're having an El Nino event. And the irony is that this usually occurs somewhere around December 25th, Christ's birthday, and so that's why it's called El Nino, which means baby boy. But this event, this phenomenon, is due to a reversal of all the winds and water currents in the South Pacific, and has a huge weather pattern effect when this happens. So this diagram shows the process in action. So first, the trade winds that would normally blow into South America and push surface waters to the west, they basically weaken and then they reverse direction. And this change in the wind allows warm equator water from the western Pacific to move east towards South America. And this movement of warm water and air towards South America suppresses the upwelling that would normally happen in that area for just a few weeks or so. Because ocean currents are so important to climates, this El Nino event has a lot of consequences, as it reduces the upwelling that is going off of the South American coast, which essentially decreases the productivity, which dramatically reduces the fish population. So it is also a widespread effect that goes on all over the world, including like cooler waters in the southeastern United States where would normally have an unusually dry condition. So essentially, the southern oscillation of El Nino is the weakening of the trade winds near the South America. It's weakened allows this warm water from the Western Pacific to move eastward, as we had said. So this periodic change in winds and ocean currents collectively we call the El Nino Southern Oscillation, or it gets an abbreviation ENSO. And so that concludes our ocean currents.